Yes, my pleasure to be back with you again this morning. Such a nice and a wonderful time to be alive. Now, I'd like us to look at the options available to you when you are making a property purchase or transaction and you don't have your complete money. In other words, you want to purchase a property and you want to go about it making instrumental payments. Installment payment. What are your options? Are you supposed to do? The first thing to say is that if you are not making a full payment, for a property, for land, for property, then it's important that you begin with a contract of sale. A contract of sale sets out the the timelines and the installments that you intend to make in making that purchase. It's a binding agreement between the seller and the buyer, you know, and to that extent, both parties, by the execution of the contract of sale, have agreed to be bound to complete the transaction. And so it's also important, for the sake of the sanctity of the contract, that and it's advisable indeed, that the deed of assignment could also be prepared and signed, but of course that deed of assignment will not pass, will not be handed over to the seller, to the buyer, until he has completed his payment, but this is to ensure that should the seller die in the process or during the period of the transaction, the buyer is not looking for the deed of assignment, or will not have the disadvantage of the deed of assignment being unsigned. So worst case, if the deed of assignment was signed, even at the takeoff of the transaction, what will happen is that the deed of assignment could still be left in the custody of the lawyer to the seller until the entire transaction is completed. It's also advisable, if the payment that is being made is substantial, that the buyer could insist that he wants to have possession, pending when he completes payment. But the possession notwithstanding, he will not have access to the final document, which is the deed of assignment. The important thing to say is that the contract of sale, ceased off the transaction to the extent that none of the parties is permitted to pull out of the transaction, even if there is someone coming with a better offer, because all of the elements of contract is already complete in that contract of sale. Consideration has passed, acceptance has been made, acceptance has been also made, and then consideration has passed. And so these things are material to ensure a seamless transaction, and they are necessary and critical steps that should be taken. And it's always important that you do not allow sentiment to come in when you want to make these transactions. You will find sometimes, a friend wants to buy another friend's property, and he just begins to make installment payment and nothing documented. This is a red flag, and it could backfire. I have had practical experiences of this kind of transactions, and I'm speaking from the place of experience. For instance, there was one particular case that we I had cause to handle in the course of my practice. This was a case where the vendor offered to sell a piece of his land to the seller, who was our client, to the buyer, who was our client. The client made an offer to make the payment for the land in two installments. He sent out the first installment, you know, sent out the first installment, um, and afterwards, after agreement had been reached, the seller decides that he was no longer going to proceed. He was no longer going to proceed. Maybe he had a superior or a higher offer, and he was making a request for a higher payment for the same land. And our client declined. The same issues dispute could not be resolved between parties, and eventually the thing ended up in the court. And it was now for the court to determine who was in a better place to take possession of the land. Our client insisted that he has taken the right steps. He has made the first, offered the first consideration before the client declined, before the seller declined. But because the seller was declining at the point of giving effect to the bank draft, the court agreed that yes, there were all the elements of the contract was already in place, but because consideration has not passed, the buyer who was our client could not indeed uh, claim to have bought, because consideration is indeed the enabler for the enforcement of any contract. But we disagreed because at the point that the draft had been sent, there was nothing left for our client to do. What was left was for the seller to go and cash the draft. And so we went on appeal, and the Court of Appeal agreed with us and said, look, the draft had been given, the draft is as good as money. So it was for the seller to take ownership of the draft and go and cash it. And it was at that point he made a U-turn that he was not going to sell again. And so the court had to make an order for specific performance for the completion of the contract. So this is very important. That's why when you want to make these transactions, ensure that the proper documentations are made to protect you and your funds. You're welcome once again. Thank you so much for having me.